Hi, welcome. I'm Richard Thomas Lane, and I'd like to introduce you to the Jonas Stuyvesant Saga, an action-adventure series that I'm writing. What I'm going to lay out for you here is a little bit about who Jonas Stuyvesant is, and describe the first three books, books 1, 2, and 3. Tell you a little bit about what's in each one of them. Hopefully that will whet your appetite, and you'd like to get into and start reading this series. Probably the easiest way to get into that is to talk about how the idea came to me. I was sitting musing one afternoon, and I had a mental image, not quite a hallucination, but a strong mental image of a man in his 60s coming out of a restaurant. As he stepped out into the street, a darkened SUV, I'm sorry, this is a little melodramatic, but a darkened SUV comes roaring down, hits him, and he goes flipping into the air and falling onto the sidewalk. All of a sudden, I had a bunch of questions. Who is this guy? Who's trying to kill him? And I came up with two answers. So the first answer was the CIA. CIA? Okay, this is an ex-CIA agent. Why would the CIA want to kill him? Well, there's a rumor floating around that he's writing a memoir. Okay, and who else might want to kill him? The Chinese. The Chinese. Why would the Chinese want to kill him? And what year is this anyway? And it turns out that this is in the early 1980s. And the answers that started coming was Jonas Stuyvesant, that's the name of the character that I eventually came up with. Jonas Stuyvesant really hates the Chinese. He's been in battle with the Chinese for years. Why? Because when he was a prisoner of war in Korea, he was tortured. That tends to get under a person's skin. So Jonas has a lifelong mission to fight Chinese communism. I came of age during the Civil Rights era and the Vietnam War era. In 1966, I joined the Marine Corps. And the Marine Corps, in its wisdom, I was expecting to go to Vietnam right away. In their wisdom, they sent me to Hawaii and Cherry Point, North Carolina, and Okinawa, all before I got to Vietnam in 1970, where I was a battalion message center chief stationed just outside of Da Nang. After I got out of Vietnam, I went back to college. Those were troubling years for me, processing what was going on. I eventually became an alcoholism counselor and then managed to transition into doing psychotherapy, specializing in both couples and in trauma work. And in trauma work, I worked with a lot of people who had post-traumatic stress disorder, whether that came from childhood sexual molestation or physical abuse, or other incidents, including veterans who are experiencing trauma from combat. I also was in New York City for 9/11, and I did a lot of work after 9/11 with people who were traumatized by that event. So I bring to this whole series some personal experience on many, many different levels, having been overseas myself, and working with people who've been affected by trauma. That infuses the work. In 1904, the Japanese occupied the Korean peninsula. And they held on to that all the way through World War II in 1945, when we finally defeated them. One of the problems was that all the lands that the Japanese had occupied in the Pacific had now to be occupied by the winners of the war, and that included Korea. We didn't have enough troops to take care of all of Korea, so we invited the Russians in north of the 38th parallel, and we took charge of south of the 38th parallel. That's how Korea got divided up into the north and the south. But the Koreans wanted to unify and reunite both sides. In the north, you had Kim Il-sung, a puppet of Stalin, and in the south, you had Syngman Rhee, who was a puppet of the United States. And both of these individuals were itching to go to war with one another. Finally, Kim Il-sung convinced Stalin that the political conditions were right, and Stalin gave him a go-ahead to launch a blitzkrieg attack on the South. The North Koreans did not expect that we'd be able to muster forces quick enough to stop them in their push down the South Korean peninsula. We did get troops in. It was a horrible, horrible first 3 months in the war. Now, I've read a lot of military history, a lot of horrible battles in the Civil War, in World War I, in World War II. This was as bad as any battles that the United States has ever fought. So I have my character, Jonas Stuyvesant, a green second lieutenant, basically in retreat for the entire first 3 months of the Korean War. We got our asses kicked. Now there's a character arc here. Jonas Stuyvesant has a mission, and the mission is to get his troops home, to get them out of Korea alive. But the other thing that he must do is attend to the mission. And I want to tell you that one of the hard things for any military officer, a line officer in combat, is that these two goals are not compatible. And so the first novel, Forgotten Valor, because this is the valor of these men who fought in the Forgotten War, or Korean War. What Jonas Stuyvesant has to come to terms with is the hard choices that a line officer makes. This is a particularly painful piece of American history. So MacArthur did a brilliant end run around the North Korean troops who had invaded the South. He took the capital of Seoul. The North Koreans, in a panic, began retreating out of South Korea into the north. And about a month later, MacArthur is rallying his troops to invade North Korea. Given our experience in World War II, where we had unconditional surrender on our mind, and that worked with both Germany and Japan, it makes sense that MacArthur, one of the prime architects of our strategy in World War II, would want to push all the way and defeat North Korea entirely. Unfortunately, North Korea borders with China, and although China was, you would expect, exhausted from its own World War II experience fighting the Japanese, and from the civil war between the communists and the nationalists that erupted right after World War II, MacArthur and most of the people in our government did not expect that China would rally itself to protect its border, to come to the aid of North Korea, but it did. As they launched a surprise attack right after Thanksgiving of 1950, thousands of Americans, British, Australians, Turks were caught up and put into prisoner of war camps. They were starved, they were beaten, they were tortured. It was a horrendous experience. But what was even more devastating for the American public is that while Americans were held captive, many of them, under duress, signed petitions to end the war. They made statements to the public. They made public broadcasts over the radio condemning the militarism of the United States. Back home during the McCarthy era, which that's what it was, 1950 to 1953, a hysteria broke out over how could American troops collaborate with the enemy this way. So this is the story I want to tell. What really happened and how this could have happened, why it happened, what these men went through. The other thing that I want to cover in the second volume is that a very interesting thing happened during the Korean War. We had had African American troops in the Civil War, World War I, World War II, but they had always been in segregated units, often run by white officers. We were under such duress in the Korean War that black soldiers had to be integrated into white units. So all of a sudden you have white and black soldiers working together, and strange friendships and relationships developed out of that, particularly in the prisoner of war camp. And that's a story I want to tell. Jonas Stuyvesant and Leon Samuels, a black lieutenant who was trained in West Point. I'll just leave that for the moment and go on to volume 3. Jonas does get out of the POW camp. The war ended in 1953, ended in a stalemate that goes on until this day. But Jonas Stuyvesant, having been tortured in the POW camp, remember that way back at the beginning of this saga? That was the thing that came to me in this little vision. This is why he hated the Chinese. He becomes a CIA agent, and in 1959, he parachutes into Tibet. Why is he going into Tibet? The man who tortured him is now part of the Chinese occupation force in Tibet. And Jonas wants to make things hard for the Chinese communists, but he also wants to get back at the man who tortured him, Chen Jingguan. He parachutes into Tibet with one explicit goal. No, not the goal of killing Chen. That's his personal private goal, his private war. But there's another political situation that's brewing in Tibet. The Chinese, who've occupied Tibet since 1949, are threatening, or at least the Tibetans think, that they are threatening to take the Dalai Lama out of Lhasa and imprison him in Peking. Jonas parachutes into Tibet, makes his way into Lhasa with the idea of contacting the Dalai Lama to see if the Dalai Lama wants help to escape into India. Does he want the help from the CIA? And in the process, Jonas falls in love with a young female Tibetan shaman. I'll just say this much more about the story. Jonas is quite the militarist. He has no trouble inflicting violence upon his enemies. The young woman that he falls in love with is a Buddhist, and she's a pacifist. They are going to have some struggles between them as their romance develops, as they cooperate together to try to get the Dalai Lama safely out of Tibet and into India. These are the first 3 volumes in the series. I hope I have whetted your appetite and that you'd like to take a look at these volumes. I'll see you in those pages. Thank you.